What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected and soft-spoken actors walks into what should have been a routine daytime television interview, only to find himself facing a host seemingly determined to provoke, belittle, and publicly dismantle him? What happens when professionalism collides with pettiness, when celebrity courtesy meets calculated hostility, and when a calm demeanor is tested by an agenda-driven confrontation? Today, we're diving into one of the most talked about and controversial moments in daytime television history, a moment that left viewers stunned, producers scrambling, and security stepping in. This is the story of how Ryan Gosling, an actor widely admired for his introspection, humility, and restraint, found himself in a verbal battlefield that spiraled far beyond a standard promotional appearance. A situation that began with polite smiles and applause would ultimately end with raised voices, an uncomfortable studio silence, and one of Hollywood's biggest stars being escorted off set. Before we break it all down, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think talk show hosts sometimes cross the line with their guests, or is confrontation just part of the job? Let us know what you think. Now let's rewind and look at what really happened that day. The morning began like countless others at the studio in New York City. Ryan Gosling arrived early, dressed simply, carrying a folder of notes and a calm, focused energy. According to multiple crew members, he greeted staff warmly, thanked the assistants who guided him through the building, and even surprised a few longtime employees by remembering their names from previous visits. For those behind the scenes, it was a reminder of why Gosling had earned such a strong reputation, not just as an actor, but as a professional. His publicist had assured him this would be a standard promotional interview. The purpose was clear: discuss his latest film, touch on his creative process, maybe share a light anecdote or two, and move on. Nothing controversial, nothing confrontational, just another stop on a long press tour. In the makeup room, Gosling chatted casually with the stylists, joking lightly and patiently, answering questions about filming schedules and character preparation. There was no sign of tension, no warning that the tone of the day was about to shift dramatically. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the building, the atmosphere was very different. According to multiple sources later cited by entertainment insiders, Joy Behar had spent much of her morning scrolling through social media. Specifically, she had been reacting to recent interviews in which Gosling had spoken openly about his desire to stay out of political discourse. His comments, measured, neutral, and focused on his craft, had apparently struck a nerve. What Gosling viewed as a personal boundary, Behar seemed to interpret as avoidance, privilege, or even silent complicity. By the time Gosling was reviewing his talking points in the green room, Behar was reportedly already agitated. Producers noticed her pacing. Assistants exchanged uneasy glances. Still, no one anticipated just how far things would go once the cameras started rolling. When the show went live, everything appeared perfectly normal. Whoopi Goldberg opened the segment with her usual warmth and authority, welcoming the audience and introducing the guest with genuine enthusiasm. Applause filled the studio as Ryan Gosling walked onto the set, offering his familiar half smile and a small wave to the crowd. The energy was positive, friendly, encouraging. "Ryan Gosling, everybody," Whoopi announced, her voice carrying excitement and respect. "Thanks for being here with us." "Thanks for having me," Gosling replied, taking his seat. "It's always good to be back." The first question came from Sarah Haynes, who kept things light and professional. She asked about Gosling's latest film and the challenges of stepping into such a complex role. Gosling leaned forward slightly, hands folded, and answered in the thoughtful, unhurried way fans had come to expect. He didn't rush. He didn't perform. He reflected. "The character really challenged me in ways I didn't expect," he explained. "When you play someone dealing with internal conflict, you have to find that quiet space where their fears and hopes coexist." The audience listened attentively. Heads nodded. Everything was going smoothly, but beneath the surface, tension was quietly building. As Gosling continued speaking, Joy Behar shifted in her seat. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and glanced toward the audience as if waiting for her moment. When she finally spoke, the tone of the conversation changed. What followed was no longer about film. It was about politics, about responsibility, about whether silence itself could be considered a statement. Gosling, visibly surprised but still composed, attempted to redirect the conversation back to his work. He spoke calmly about respecting differing viewpoints and believing that not every artist needs to comment on every issue publicly, but with each measured response, the tension escalated. The audience grew quieter, the smiles faded, and the sense that something was going wrong became impossible to ignore. From there, the exchange only intensified until producers were forced to intervene and security was quietly called to the side of the stage. What began as a routine interview had turned into a confrontation no one had planned for, and one that would be replayed, debated, and dissected for years to come. And that raises the question viewers are still asking today. When does a tough interview become a personal attack? And who, if anyone, crossed the line? As Ryan Gosling continued speaking, his voice remained calm, steady, and reflective. He explained that for him, acting was never about pretending or performing emotions on command. It was about honesty, about digging deep into uncomfortable places and allowing real feelings to surface naturally. He spoke about truth, not as a concept, but as something that had to be felt internally before it could ever be shown on screen. For me, Gosling said, choosing his words carefully, it's about finding the truth within yourself. It's not about pretending to feel something. It's about discovering what's already there and being brave enough to let it show. The audience leaned in. There was a noticeable stillness in the studio, the kind that only happens when people feel they're listening to something genuine. Even the other hosts, who were known for interrupting or redirecting conversations, seemed momentarily captivated. Heads nodded. A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. This was the Ryan Gosling viewers expected to see, thoughtful, introspective, and deeply invested in his craft. This was the kind of interview Gosling had built his reputation on. Not flashy, not controversial, just meaningful conversation rooted in authenticity and respect. For a brief moment, it felt like the interview was unfolding exactly as planned. Then Joy Behar spoke. "Ryan," she said, "it was just one word, but..." Something about the way she said it immediately altered the energy in the room. Her tone was sharper, more deliberate. The warmth that had filled the studio only seconds earlier seemed to drain away. The audience sensed it too. A subtle tension settled in, thick and unmistakable. "I have to ask you about your recent comments," Behar continued, fixing her gaze on Gosling. "Specifically, your decision to stay out of politics. Don't you think that's a luxury, especially for someone in your position?" The shift was instant. Gosling's expression remained polite. But there was a barely perceptible change in his posture. He straightened slightly in his chair, clasping his hands together, a physical sign that he recognized the conversation had just taken a different turn. He didn't look offended, but he did look alert, aware that he was now stepping onto more dangerous ground. "Well, Joy," he began evenly, his voice calm and controlled, "I think everyone has the right to decide how they use their platform. For me personally, I prefer to let my work speak for itself." It was a measured response, respectful, non-confrontational, the kind of answer designed to acknowledge the question without escalating the situation. But Behar wasn't satisfied. She leaned forward slightly, her eyebrows raised, pressing the issue further. "But isn't that just another way of saying you don't care about issues that affect real people?" she asked. "Because when you have a platform as big as yours and you choose not to use it, some would argue that silence itself becomes a statement." A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Gosling paused, not out of hesitation, but out of thoughtfulness. He took a breath, clearly choosing his next words carefully. "I wouldn't agree with that," he said. "Caring about people doesn't always mean speaking publicly about every issue. Sometimes it means listening, sometimes it means supporting causes privately, and sometimes it means telling stories that help people feel seen." The tension in the room continued to build. The other hosts exchanged quick glances. This was no longer a discussion about acting or creativity. It had become something else entirely, a philosophical standoff about responsibility, privilege, and expectation. Behar shook her head slightly, unconvinced. "But don't you think people look to you for leadership?" she pressed. "You have influence whether you like it or not. Isn't choosing not to speak just avoiding accountability?" At this point, the audience was split. Some nodded along with Behar's line of questioning. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that the conversation was veering from challenging into confrontational. Gosling remained composed, but the shift in his demeanor was now unmistakable. His smile had faded, not into anger, but into seriousness. "I don't see it as avoiding anything," he replied. "I see it as respecting the fact that I'm an actor, not an expert on every issue. I think there's value in knowing your limits." The studio fell quiet. That silence was heavy, electric. It was the kind of silence that signals a moment has crossed an invisible line. The kind that makes producers tense behind the cameras and audience members wonder what will happen next. Behar opened her mouth again, clearly prepared to continue pushing. The atmosphere had changed completely from the warm, reflective interview that had begun just minutes earlier. What started as a thoughtful discussion had now turned into a challenge, not just of Gosling's views, but of his character. This was no longer about whether actors should be political. It was about whether Ryan Gosling was being judged, in real time, for refusing to play a role off-screen that others expected him to perform. And as the cameras kept rolling, it became clear to everyone watching, both in the studio and at home, that this interview was heading toward a breaking point. Behar didn't let the moment pass. Instead, she repeated his words again, but this time mockingly, stretching them out with thinly veiled sarcasm. "So," she said, her lips curling slightly, "your choice is to stay comfortable, to not risk your career by taking a stand on anything that actually matters." That was it. Something changed in Ryan Gosling. The polite smile that had been resting on his face for the entire interview finally disappeared. It wasn't replaced by anger, not yet, but by something sharper, more focused. He leaned back slightly in his chair, no longer trying to soften the moment, and studied Joy Behar with a level of attention that made the air feel heavier. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, but unmistakably serious. "Joy," he said, pausing just long enough for the room to feel it, "do you actually want to talk about my movie? Or did you invite me here just to attack me?" The question didn't just land. It hung. The other hosts froze in place. Hands that had been resting on cue cards stopped moving. Smiles vanished. Sarah Haynes stared across the table, stunned. The audience, which moments earlier had been murmuring, went completely silent. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, lingering on Gosling's face as if sensing that something irreversible had just happened. For a brief, electric moment, time felt suspended. Behar had pushed one of Hollywood's most respected and famously restrained actors to his breaking point, and now, live on television, everyone was about to witness what happened when Ryan Gosling stopped playing defense. Behar's eyes flashed. Instead of softening her tone or pulling back, she doubled down. Attack. "You?" she scoffed, her voice rising. "Oh, that's rich. Poor little Ryan Gosling can't handle a few tough questions." A ripple of shock moved through the audience. "Maybe," she continued, leaning back in her chair with a dismissive shrug, "you should stick to romantic comedies if you can't handle real conversations." The insult hit the studio like a slap. Audible gasps came from the audience. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Sarah Haynes's jaw literally dropped open. This was no longer sharp questioning or pointed debate. This was personal. Professional courtesy, the unspoken contract between host and guest, had been crossed in full view of millions. For a few seconds, Gosling didn't move. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react impulsively. He simply sat there, absorbing the moment. The silence, the weight of what had just been said. Then slowly he nodded. Once. "There it is," he said. His voice was calm, but it carried a gravity that pulled everyone forward in their seats. I was waiting for that. The studio felt smaller now, tighter. "Joy," he continued, choosing each word carefully, "I came here to talk about a film that deals with heavy themes: identity, moral responsibility, and the cost of silence. A movie that asks hard questions." Without shouting answers, he leaned slightly forward now, no longer retreating. "I didn't come here to be insulted. And I didn't come here to be told that my career only has value if I perform outrage on demand." The audience erupted, not in applause, but in murmurs of stunned disbelief. This wasn't rehearsed. This wasn't scripted. This was raw, unscripted, television unfolding in real time. Behar tried to interject, but Gosling continued, still calm, still measured, but no longer willing to be misrepresented. "You don't get to define my integrity because I refuse to play the role you want me to play off-screen," he said. "And you don't get to question my empathy just because I choose to express it differently." The tension was now unmistakable. Producers backstage were reportedly standing. Interns froze. This was the kind of moment daytime television was never designed to handle. Behar opened her mouth again, but before she could speak, Gosling finished with a sentence that landed harder than anything before it. "If this conversation was never about my work," he said, "then we should at least be honest about that." Silence. Not the polite kind, the uncomfortable kind, the kind that lingers too long. Everyone in the studio understood what had just happened. The power dynamic had shifted. The interview was no longer under Behar's control. Gosling hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted anyone. But he had done something far more disruptive. He had refused to be cornered, and in that moment, it became clear that this wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was a reckoning, live, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. Behar didn't let the moment breathe. Instead, she pressed forward, her voice noticeably sharper now, cutting through the studio air with unmistakable intensity. "When you have millions of followers and that level of influence," she said pointedly, "isn't staying silent actually a political stance?" The question landed hard. For the first time since the interview began, the other hosts visibly shifted in their seats. They exchanged quick, uneasy looks with one another, the kind that silently say, "This isn't where we thought this was going." This was supposed to be a conversation about creativity, storytelling, and a new film, not a philosophical interrogation about moral responsibility and power. The discomfort on the panel was unmistakable. Still, Ryan Gosling didn't react emotionally. He didn't roll his eyes or raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. Instead, he waited until the room quieted, then answered calmly, his tone measured and deliberate. "I think caring about issues," he said, "and feeling required to publicly share your political opinions are two very different things." He paused briefly, then continued, clearly wanting to remove any ambiguity. "Joy, I vote. I support causes I believe in. I donate. I stay informed. I just don't think every actor needs to become a political commentator. That should have been the end of it. A reasonable boundary. A clear explanation." But Behar leaned forward in her chair, clearly unsatisfied. "So you're saying actors shouldn't use their platforms to help people understand important issues?" she shot back. "Because that sounds selfish to me." Ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Some gasped softly. Others whispered to the person beside them. This was no longer a polite disagreement. It was a confrontation unfolding in real time. The friendly energy from earlier in the segment had completely evaporated, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension that hung over the studio lights. This wasn't the interview anyone had expected. Gosling inhaled slowly. When he spoke again, there was a subtle change in his voice. Not anger, but firmness. Resolve. "I'm saying," he replied, "that maybe we should trust people to think for themselves instead of assuming they need celebrities to tell them how to vote." The words echoed louder than he likely intended. That's when it happened. Behar's face visibly flushed, her jaw tightened. The calm mask she usually maintained on air cracked, just enough for the audience to notice. "Oh," she snapped, "so now you're saying we're telling people how to vote?" Her voice rose. The tension spiked instantly. "Is that what you think this show does?" Before Gosling could respond, Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward, lifting her hand slightly in a clear attempt to de-escalate. "Maybe we should talk about the movie," she said carefully, her tone firm but diplomatic. "That's why Ryan's here." For a split second, it seemed like the confrontation might pause, but Behar wasn't done. "No, Whoopi," she said, waving the suggestion away without looking at her. "I want to hear this." She turned back to Gosling, her voice now edged with accusation. "Ryan thinks we're just celebrities telling people what to think. Is that right, Ryan?" The studio went dead quiet. All eyes turned to Gosling. Cameras zoomed slightly closer. Producers backstage stiffened. This was the moment, where interviews either recovered or completely unraveled. Gosling met Behar's gaze. He didn't look angry, he didn't look smug, but he did look resolute. "Joy," he said evenly, "I think you're putting words in my mouth." A collective intake of breath could be felt across the room. "I never said anything about this show," he continued. "I was talking about my own choices, my own boundaries, as an actor." The silence afterward was heavy, electric, uncomfortable. Behar opened her mouth to respond, but for once, no words came immediately. The exchange had shifted. This was no longer about politics, it was about control. About whether Gosling would accept the narrative being placed on him or push back against it. The audience could feel it. This was a line being drawn in real time, live on television, and as the tension continued to build, it became increasingly clear that this interview was no longer under control, and that what happened next would define the moment far more than anything that had already been said.